Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Think about a goal you've had for a long time. Maybe it's a business you keep planning to start, a relationship pattern you keep promising yourself you'll change, a creative project that lives permanently in the someday folder, a level of health or income or peace that you can clearly picture, and yet somehow you're still not there. Now ask yourself this honestly: is anything outside of you actually stopping you? Not the economy, not your schedule, not the timing, you. Are you the one standing in your own way? Most people, when they ask that question seriously, get a quiet, uncomfortable answer. That discomfort is exactly where this book begins. Welcome back. I'm Clara, your AI learning companion, and today we're doing a deep dive into one of the most psychologically rich self-help books of the last decade, The Mountain Is You by Brianna Wiest. This isn't a book about motivation. It's not about hustle or hacks or finding your passion. It's about something quieter and more difficult, understanding why intelligent, capable people consistently block their own progress and how to stop doing it. By the end of this video, you'll have a clear, concrete understanding of what self-sabotage actually is at a psychological level, which is very different from what most people assume. You'll understand the specific emotional and cognitive mechanisms that drive it, and you'll walk away with a 3-step action plan drawn directly from Wiest's framework that you can begin applying today. This one is worth your full attention. Let's get into it. Brianna Wiest is an American author and essayist who built a substantial readership through her emotionally intelligent, psychologically grounded writing on platforms like Thought Catalog before publishing several books. The Mountain Is You, published in 2020, became a quiet phenomenon, the kind of book that gets passed between friends with the words, "I don't know, it just got me." The central argument of this book is deceptively simple, and I want to state it clearly before we go any further. Self-sabotage is not irrational. It is a coping mechanism, one that made sense at some point in your life and that you are now unconsciously repeating even though the original need for it no longer exists. The problem Wiest is solving is this: most self-help tells you what to do, but not why you're not already doing it. And the reason that gap exists is because the real block isn't informational, it's psychological. It's rooted in old emotional logic that your nervous system still treats as valid. The mountain in the title is a metaphor Wiest uses throughout the book. The mountain is not the obstacle in front of you. The mountain is you, your unprocessed emotions, your outdated beliefs, your fear of your own potential. And the only way forward is not around it, but through it. That's the frame. Now let's go deep into how she builds that argument, concept by concept. Most people think of self-sabotage as stupidity, as doing things they know are wrong, and that framing is part of what makes it so frustrating. If you know better and still don't do better, you conclude that something is wrong with your willpower, your discipline, your character. Wiest challenges that conclusion entirely. Her argument is that self-sabotage is not a failure of willpower. It is a conflict between what your conscious mind wants and what your subconscious mind believes is safe. Let me make that concrete. Imagine someone who consciously wants financial success. They set goals, they research, they start businesses, and yet every time they get close to a real breakthrough, something happens. They make a reckless decision. They undermine a key relationship. They self-destruct the very thing they built. From the outside, and even from the inside, it looks like carelessness or fear of success. But Wiest would ask a different question. What does this person unconsciously associate with money or success? Maybe growing up, financial success in their family meant distance, or conflict, or pretension, or loss of belonging. So somewhere in their nervous system, success has been coded as dangerous. Not dangerous in an abstract sense, dangerous in a felt, emotional, body-level sense. And the nervous system, which is fundamentally wired for survival and belonging, will reliably steer away from perceived danger, even when that danger is something the conscious mind desperately wants. This is the foundational insight of the book, and it reframes everything. Self-sabotage, then, is a protection mechanism. The psyche is doing exactly what it was trained to do. It's not working against you. It's working according to an old program that you haven't yet updated. This distinction matters enormously because it changes the approach. If self-sabotage is a character flaw, the solution is punishment. More discipline, more shame, more willpower. But if self-sabotage is a learned protective response, the solution is understanding. Finding out what you're protecting yourself from and whether that protection is still necessary. The next time you catch yourself in a self-sabotaging pattern, procrastinating, avoiding, overindulging, picking a fight, pause and ask not, why am I so weak, but what am I protecting myself from right now? Write that question down and sit with it. You're not looking for a perfect answer immediately. You're beginning the practice of approaching your own behavior with curiosity rather than condemnation. Now let's look at why we self-sabotage, the root causes. Wiest identifies several core reasons why self-sabotage takes hold in a person's life, and understanding these is critical, because each root cause calls for a slightly different response. The first root cause is the coexistence of desire and fear. The most common root of self-sabotage is simply this: you want something and you're terrified of it at the same time. This sounds paradoxical, but it's actually very common. Consider someone who genuinely wants a loving, committed relationship. They go on dates, they're charming, they connect with people. And then, right around the point where things get serious, they start finding reasons it won't work. They become critical. They pull back. They sabotage. Why? Because commitment means vulnerability. And vulnerability, depending on what they've experienced, might feel deeply unsafe. The desire is real. The fear is also real. And when those two forces collide, the fear often wins. Not because the person is cowardly, but because the fear is operating at a deeper neurological level than the desire. The second root cause is core beliefs that contradict your goals. This is one of Wiest's sharpest observations. We all carry a set of beliefs about ourselves, what we deserve, what we're capable of, what people like us can achieve. These beliefs were largely formed in childhood based on what we observed, what we were told, and what we experienced. The problem is that these beliefs often operate invisibly. You might consciously believe you deserve success while unconsciously holding the belief that you're fundamentally not good enough, that success would be found out to be a fluke, that you'd eventually disappoint everyone, that you're an imposter. When your goals require you to hold a self-image that contradicts your core beliefs, your psyche experiences tension. And to resolve that tension, it will often subtly steer you back toward the version of yourself your beliefs say you're supposed to be. The third root cause is unfamiliarity coded as danger. Your brain has a very sophisticated threat detection system, and one of the things it flags as potentially threatening is the unfamiliar. Novelty, in evolutionary terms, historically carried risk. So when you're moving toward a significantly different version of your life, a different career, a different social circle, a different level of achievement, even if that change is objectively good, it can trigger a deep neurological discomfort. And many people, unconsciously, will begin dismantling the new situation to return to what feels familiar. Not comfortable necessarily, but known. The familiar feels safe, even when it's harmful. The unfamiliar feels dangerous, even when it's good. The fourth root cause is unmet needs finding indirect expression. Wiest makes an important point that some self-sabotaging behaviors are actually distorted attempts to meet a real need. Emotional eating, for example, isn't simply weakness. It's often an attempt to self-soothe a genuine emotional need that isn't being addressed directly. Procrastination isn't always laziness. It can be a response to perfectionism, which is itself often a response to a need for safety from judgment or failure. When you understand the underlying need, you can begin to meet it in a healthier way, rather than suppressing the behavior through willpower, which rarely works long-term. The fifth root cause is emotional immaturity. This one requires a bit of care in how it's explained because emotional immaturity sounds like an insult. Wiest doesn't mean it that way. She means that many of us were never taught as children how to process, name, and move through difficult emotions. We were taught to suppress them, distract from them, project them onto others, or avoid them entirely. The result is that as adults, we carry a significant emotional backlog, unprocessed grief, anger, shame, fear. And when life pushes us towards something significant, those unresolved emotions surface. And rather than process them, we do what we learned. We avoid. We self-sabotage. We keep life small enough that we never have to face the feelings. Here's your actionable step. Take one self-sabotaging pattern in your life right now and try to trace it to one of these 5 root causes. Write down which one resonates most. Then ask, what would it look like to address that root cause directly rather than fighting the surface behavior? Now let's talk about triggers, how self-sabotage gets activated. Knowing the root causes is necessary but not sufficient. Wiest also helps readers understand the triggers, the specific situations, emotions, and thresholds that activate self-sabotage. One of the most important insights here is what we might call the upper limit problem. The idea is that each of us has an internal thermostat, an unconscious sense of how much good we can tolerate, how much happiness, success, love, ease, and abundance we believe we're allowed to have. When life exceeds that upper limit, when things go too well, the psyche gets uncomfortable and it starts finding ways to bring things back down to a level that feels familiar and manageable. Think about the person who gets a major promotion and immediately starts having explosive arguments with their partner, or the entrepreneur whose business finally takes off and suddenly they develop a serious anxiety problem that derails them, or the individual who loses a significant amount of weight and then inexplicably falls back into old patterns. These aren't random. They're the upper limit kicking in, the subconscious saying, "This is more than I know how to hold. Let me make it smaller." Wiest also points to emotional triggers, specific feelings that act as automatic activators of self-sabotaging behavior. For many people, the feeling of vulnerability is a trigger. So is boredom. So is excitement, because excitement and anxiety feel physiologically similar, and some people have learned to interpret high positive arousal as danger rather than joy. Understanding your specific triggers, not just the behaviors, but the feelings that precede the behaviors, is a crucial part of the work. For the next week, keep a simple trigger log. When you notice yourself in a self-sabotaging behavior, or even feeling the urge toward one, write down what happened in the 30 minutes before. What were you feeling? What was the situation? Over time, you'll start to see patterns. Patterns are the beginning of choice. Now let's discuss how self-sabotage compounds over time. One of the most sobering parts of Wiest's argument is the observation that self-sabotage left unaddressed doesn't just stay flat, it compounds. And the mechanism by which it compounds is shame. Here's how the cycle works. You have a goal, you self-sabotage, you feel ashamed about self-sabotaging. That shame makes you feel worse about yourself. Feeling worse about yourself reinforces the core belief that you're not capable, not deserving, not enough. That reinforced belief makes the next act of self-sabotage more likely, and so the cycle deepens. Wiest is very direct about this. Shame is not a useful motivator. Research in psychology consistently suggests that shame, a global negative evaluation of the self, tends to lead to disengagement, hiding, and more of the behavior that generated the shame. It is guilt, a specific negative evaluation of a behavior that is more likely to produce positive change. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." The difference in outcomes is significant. So when people use self-criticism and harsh inner judgment as a strategy to motivate change, they're often making the self-sabotage worse, not better. They're adding another layer to the cycle. Wiest's antidote to this is not self-congratulation or ignoring your patterns. It's what she calls self-awareness without self-judgment, the ability to look clearly at what you're doing and why without the added weight of condemnation. This is psychologically sophisticated advice. It's much easier to say than to do, but the practice begins with a simple reframe. Instead of, I'm doing this again, what is wrong with me? Try, I'm doing this again. What am I trying to protect myself from? That single shift in language begins to dissolve the shame spiral because it moves you from self-condemnation to self-understanding. The next time you catch yourself in the shame spiral after a self-sabotaging behavior, try writing this in a journal. I did this behavior. I'm not doing this because I'm broken. I'm doing this because some part of me is trying to protect or avoid or cope with something. What is that something? This interrupts the shame cycle and redirects your energy toward understanding. Now let's talk about recognizing your specific self-sabotage patterns. One of the most practically useful aspects of Wiest's work is that she helps readers recognize the many forms that self-sabotage can take, because it doesn't always look like obvious destruction. Sometimes it's extremely subtle, and that subtlety is precisely what makes it so effective at avoiding detection. Let's walk through some of the most common manifestations she discusses. First, chronic procrastination. This one seems obvious, but Wiest's take on it is more nuanced than typical productivity advice. She frames procrastination not as laziness, but as emotional avoidance. You're not avoiding the task. You're avoiding the emotions the task brings up. Often those emotions are related to fear of failure, fear of judgment, or the deeply uncomfortable feeling of not knowing if you're good enough. Understanding this means the solution isn't a better time management system. It's asking, what am I afraid will happen if I do this task and it doesn't go well? Second, perfectionism. Perfectionism is perhaps the most socially acceptable form of self-sabotage. It looks like high standards. It presents as conscientiousness and care, but Wiest identifies it as a defense mechanism, a way of never having to be evaluated on your actual work, because you never submit your actual work. If nothing is ever quite good enough to release, you're never quite vulnerable to rejection. The perfectionist doesn't fail because they're aiming too high. They fail because not finished is safer than finished and judged. Third, self-medication and numbing. Whether it's alcohol, food, social media scrolling, compulsive shopping, or any other form of numbing. Wiest frames these as attempts to avoid the discomfort of emotions that haven't been processed. The problem is that the emotions don't go away when you numb them. They accumulate. And the more you numb, the more there is to numb, which means the numbing has to increase over time to remain effective. Fourth, chronic busyness. This one surprises many readers. Surely being busy isn't self-sabotage, but Wiest points out that chronic, compulsive busyness can be a sophisticated avoidance strategy. If you're always doing, you never have to be. You never have to sit with your actual feelings, evaluate your actual progress, or face the questions your quieter moments might raise. And fifth, playing small. This might be the most quietly damaging pattern Wiest discusses. Playing small isn't about laziness. It's about unconsciously keeping your life beneath a certain threshold so that the risks of full engagement are never triggered. You don't apply for the bigger opportunity. You downplay your achievements. You defer to others' opinions even when you have your own clear view. You make yourself easy to overlook. This often stems from environments where visibility was unsafe, where standing out led to criticism, jealousy, rejection, or punishment. So making yourself small became a way of staying safe. And that programming can persist into adult life long after the original environment no longer exists. Review that list: procrastination, perfectionism, numbing, chronic busyness, playing small, and identify the one that most resonates with you. Then complete this sentence. The emotion I'm most trying to avoid when I do this behavior is... Naming the underlying emotion is the first step toward not being driven by it. Now we reach one of the most important sections of the book, building emotional intelligence as the foundation for real change. At roughly the midpoint of the book, Wiest pivots from diagnosis to prescription. Having established what self-sabotage is and why it happens, she turns to the question of how to actually change. And her answer, at its core, is this: The foundation of lasting change is not willpower, habit stacking, or goal setting. It is emotional intelligence. This might sound abstract, so let's get specific about what emotional intelligence means in Wiest's framework. She breaks it into several key capabilities. First, the ability to identify and name your emotions accurately. Most people, when asked how they feel, default to a small handful of words: stressed, tired, fine, overwhelmed. But these are very broad categories that obscure important information. There's a significant difference between feeling lonely and feeling misunderstood, between feeling angry and feeling humiliated, between feeling anxious and feeling excited. Research in psychology, particularly work associated with what's been called emotional granularity, suggests that people who can distinguish more precisely between similar emotional states are actually better at regulating those emotions. The specificity itself is calming and clarifying. Wiest encourages readers to expand their emotional vocabulary and their willingness to sit still long enough to actually identify what they're feeling rather than immediately acting on, suppressing, or distracting from it. Second, the ability to feel an emotion without being controlled by it. This is perhaps the most important skill Wiest describes, and it's one that many people have never been taught. The capacity to feel an emotion, to allow it to be present in your body and awareness, without having to immediately act on it, suppress it, or let it determine your behavior. Most emotions, when they're not resisted, move through the body in roughly 90 seconds to a few minutes. What extends them is resistance, the mental narrative we layer on top of them. The "I shouldn't feel this" or "this feeling means something terrible" that turns a brief emotional wave into a prolonged storm. Wiest's practical suggestion is to practice what might be called emotional witnessing. When a difficult feeling arises, instead of acting on it or suppressing it, simply naming it. "I'm feeling fear right now," and giving it permission to be present without demanding that it immediately change. Third, the ability to take responsibility without self-blame. Wiest draws an important distinction between accountability and self-blame. Accountability is clear-eyed. It says, "I made this choice and it had this consequence. What do I want to do differently?" Self-blame adds the emotional weight of shame. "I made this choice, which proves I'm fundamentally defective." The goal is to develop the capacity for honest self-assessment without the destructive overlay of shame. This is what Wiest calls radical self-responsibility, owning your patterns, your choices, and your power to change them without the added burden of treating your imperfections as proof of worthlessness. Pick one situation in your life where you currently feel stuck or frustrated. Write 3 sentences. What emotion am I actually feeling specifically? What does this emotion seem to be telling me about what I need or what I fear? And what is one small choice I could make today that responds to that underlying need rather than reacting to the surface emotion? Now let's discuss one of the most intellectually rich sections of the book, rebuilding your identity. Wiest's core argument here is that sustainable change is not primarily a behavioral project. It is an identity project. You cannot permanently maintain behaviors that contradict your self-concept. Let's make this concrete. Imagine someone who has always seen themselves as not a morning person. They try repeatedly to build an early morning routine. It works for a few days, then falls apart. From a behavioral standpoint, this might look like a discipline problem, but Wiest would argue it's an identity problem. Every time they wake up early, there's a subtle conflict with their self-concept. And over time, the identity wins. The solution is not to try harder. It's to begin building evidence that you are the kind of person who wakes up early. Small, consistent, kept commitments to yourself that begin to update the internal narrative. Wiest frames this as becoming, not achieving. The goal isn't to do the things a successful person does. It's to actually internalize a new self-concept through the accumulation of lived experience that confirms it. She also addresses the profound discomfort of this transition. When you begin to change your identity, you often encounter resistance, not just internally, but from the people around you. Social systems are remarkably effective at keeping individuals in the roles they've historically played. Friends, family, and colleagues may, often unconsciously and without malice, pressure you back into your old pattern. Because your old pattern was legible to them, it confirmed their map of who you are. Wiest describes this as a necessary form of grief, the grief of the old self that served its purpose but must now be released. She doesn't minimize this, it's real loss. But she frames it as a feature of growth, not a sign that something has gone wrong. Write down 3 statements that begin with, "I am the kind of person who," and make them true statements about someone who has achieved the goal you're currently working toward. Not aspirational statements, but identity statements. Then ask yourself, what is one small action I could take in the next 24 hours that would be completely consistent with being that person? Take that action. Now let's talk about processing the past. Why unresolved emotions are the real blocks. Wiest dedicates significant attention to something that many goal-oriented self-help books skip over almost entirely: the necessity of actually processing your past, not obsessing over it, not blaming it indefinitely, but actually digesting it, integrating old experiences in a way that allows them to stop quietly running your present-day decisions. Her argument is that unprocessed emotional experiences don't simply disappear, they get stored in the body and the nervous system, and they continue to influence behavior from below the threshold of conscious awareness. This is consistent with a substantial body of thought in trauma-informed psychology. The idea that unresolved experiences shape our automatic responses, our triggers, and our sense of what's safe. Wiest doesn't advocate for endlessly relitigating the past. What she describes is a deliberate, compassionate process of acknowledgement, going back to experiences that were painful, confusing, or formative, and giving them your adult attention. Not to be victimized by them again, but to finally offer them the understanding and witness they never received. This is a profoundly mature perspective. It recognizes that the child who experienced something difficult did not have the cognitive tools to fully process it. That child developed coping responses that made sense in that moment. And the adult carries those responses forward, not because they're broken, but because no one ever helped them update the programming. The practical work here can take many forms: journaling, therapy, somatic practices, honest conversations. Wiest doesn't prescribe a single method, but she's clear that some form of deliberate engagement with unresolved material is not optional if you want to stop self-sabotaging at the root level. She also makes a particularly important point about forgiveness, not as a moral obligation, not as something you owe anyone, but as a practical act of self-liberation. Carrying unresolved resentment, grief, or hurt doesn't punish the person or situation you hold it about. It expends your own cognitive and emotional resources. Forgiveness, in Wiest's framing, is less about the other and more about reclaiming your own energy and attention. Identify one recurring emotional theme in your life, a type of situation that consistently triggers a strong, disproportionate response. Ask yourself, when did I first feel this way? What was happening? What did I decide about myself, other people, or the world based on that experience? Write it down. You don't have to resolve it today. The act of bringing it into conscious awareness is itself a meaningful first step. In the final sections of the book, Wiest offers what might be the most quietly radical idea of the entire work. The endpoint of all this inner work is not extraordinary achievement, public recognition, or even happiness in the traditional sense. The endpoint is a life you don't need to escape from. This is worth pausing on because it is genuinely different from most success-oriented messaging. Most self-help frames the destination as more success, more impact, more abundance, more status. Wiest frames it as alignment, a life that genuinely reflects your values, your nature, your actual needs, rather than a life built around impressing others, avoiding judgment, or fulfilling someone else's template. A life you don't need to escape from is one where you don't require constant distraction, numbing, or fantasy to tolerate your daily reality. It's a life where your work has some genuine meaning, your relationships have genuine depth, and your quiet moments aren't unbearable. This reframe is important because it shifts the entire motivational structure of change. You're not grinding towards some distant future reward. You're building incrementally a present that is actually livable and genuinely yours. Wiest also addresses the concept of being your own greatest source of support, developing the kind of internal relationship with yourself that you might have sought from others. Not self-sufficiency in a closed-off, isolated way, but genuine self-trust. The kind that comes from keeping the small promises you make to yourself, from treating your own feelings as worth attending to, from learning that you can be uncomfortable and still move forward. She frames this as the ultimate act of self-respect, becoming someone you can actually rely on for yourself. Spend 5 minutes answering this question in writing. If I completely stopped worrying about what others think and stopped chasing external validation, what would I actually want my daily life to look and feel like? Let this be a genuine exploration, not a performance. The answer often contains important information about where your current life most diverges from what you actually need. We've covered a lot of ground. Let me bring it together into the 3 most important life-applicable takeaways from The Mountain Is You. 3 things you can genuinely begin applying, starting now. Step 1. Replace self-judgment with self-inquiry. The single most foundational shift this book calls for is replacing the question, "What is wrong with me?" with, "What am I protecting myself from?" Every self-sabotaging behavior has a logic. It served a purpose at some point. When you approach your own patterns with genuine curiosity rather than automatic condemnation, you open the door to actual change because you can begin to address the real need rather than fighting the symptom. Practically, this means developing a regular habit of honest self-reflection through journaling, therapy, meditation, or simply quiet thinking. Not to ruminate, but to genuinely understand your own inner landscape. The mountain is yours. You need to know its terrain. Step 2. Build emotional fluency. Your capacity to feel your emotions without being controlled by them is probably the single most important skill you can develop for long-term psychological well-being and behavioral change. This means expanding your emotional vocabulary beyond basic categories. It means practicing staying present with difficult feelings for longer than your default tolerance allows. It means distinguishing between emotions that carry useful information and the stories you layer on top of them. Emotional fluency is not the same as emotional sensitivity. It's not about feeling more intensely. It's about feeling more clearly and with more choice. The person who can sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for a distraction or an escape has a profound advantage in life because discomfort is the price of nearly everything meaningful. Step 3. Make your identity the target, not just your behavior. Stop trying to change your behavior without changing how you see yourself. Ask not just, "What do I want to do?" but "Who do I want to be?" Then begin building small, consistent evidence, kept promises, intentional choices, new experiences that updates your internal self-concept. This is slow work. It doesn't produce overnight results, but it produces durable results. Because when the behavior is rooted in a genuine self-concept shift, you don't need willpower to sustain it. It becomes an expression of who you are, not a performance you're maintaining. Here is your one direct challenge from this video. Tonight, not tomorrow, not this weekend, tonight, take 15 minutes and write about one pattern in your life that you've been criticizing yourself for, and write about it through the lens of this question. What need was this pattern originally trying to meet, and how could I meet that need in a healthier way? That's it. 15 minutes, no judgment, just honest inquiry. That one exercise, done with genuine attention, contains more transformative potential than most productivity systems you'll ever encounter because it works at the level of the root, not the symptom. The Mountain Is You is ultimately a book about self-respect. Not the performative kind, but the real kind. The kind that says, "I am worth understanding. My patterns have reasons. And I have the capacity to do this inner work and build something genuinely better." The mountain isn't your enemy. It's the accumulated material of your life. Everything unprocessed, unacknowledged, and unexplored. And climbing it, honestly and patiently, is how you discover what you're actually capable of. Wiest's deepest message, I think, is this: the life you want is not on the other side of finding some new strategy or hack. It's on the other side of knowing yourself, really knowing yourself. and deciding to stop running from that knowledge. That's a quieter kind of work than most self-help promises, but it's the work that actually changes things. If this breakdown gave you something genuinely useful, I'd love for you to join our growing community here. Subscribe, hit the bell, not for the algorithm's sake, but because we publish this kind of deep, careful book analysis regularly, and I think you'll find the library valuable. Leave a comment below. Which of the 5 root causes of self-sabotage resonated most with you? I read them all, and your reflection genuinely contributes to the conversation this channel is trying to build. I'm Clara. Thank you for learning with me today. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.